How are we looking, Rami?
We're doing good. Dimitri, can you edit the description on YouTube?
I could, but that's going to take me some time. I think at this stage
Or
I
just
think we
erase
just
the description? Just erase the description.
I think that's going to take me a while to find that. So
Okay.
why don't we just go ahead?
Yeah, we could just start. All right. So we're live on YouTube. We are live on Instagram. How are we doing on Twitter? Or sorry, X. And on the X, we are. And I believe we're live on Twitter as well. Yeah, I think we're good to start, Dimitri.
Okay, take it away, Rami.
Yes, absolutely. So 1 second. Welcome everyone to our fourth episode of Week in Review, where we chat about the good news, the bad news happening around the world. This week's episode is going to be quite interesting. There's a lot to discuss about. Um, there's been a lot of developments happening in Syria. Last time we spoke, I believe there were hints towards a ceasefire happening, but it was not official yet. And there's a lot of developments happening as well in Georgia. So we have a quite a hefty agenda to go through. So just the usual, we're going to take a lot of your questions. So feel free at the end during Q&A to drop your questions through. We'll make sure to go through them and hopefully answer some. What else? Just to maybe briefly introduce ourselves in case there's new people joining us today. My name is Rami Yahya. I'm a Palestinian born and raised in Montreal. I've been of the Concordia Student Union as a vice president. And later on in my life, I was part of the Palestinian Solidarity Campaign in Montreal as well, launched the BDS campaign. And more recently, I've been traveling the post Soviet world. I was in Ukraine when the special military operation started. And more recently, I was as well in Moldova and Georgia, where there was some ruckus around the elections and their limbo in joining the EU. Dimitri, do you want to quickly introduce yourself?
Sure. For those of you who don't know much about my background, I am a lawyer, journalist, and activist based in Montreal. Also, I spent a good bit of my time in Kalamata, Greece. At the current moment, I'm in Montreal, and we'll be here for the next couple of months. Uh, I am the founder of Reason2Resist. Rami has played many roles, worn many hats in helping us to build our platform. And he, amongst other things, is a correspondent. As he just indicated, he has reported from Georgia. Um, we focus in this program on geopolitics, and we are unabashedly anti imperialist, anti colonialist, and anti capitalist. We're all of those things, and proudly so. And one of the things we try to do in our program is to, uh, indicate ways in which some of the people who might be uh, politically aligned with us or believe they're politically aligned with us sometimes go astray and allow themselves to be uh, unduly influenced by the admittedly very powerful and effective Western propaganda system. So that's broadly speaking what our objective here is on Reason to Resist, and we thank you today for joining us.
Dimitri, we've had quite an eventful week. We started off the week, I think on Monday, you were on the Jimmy Dore show, where I think people for the first time were able to explicitly hear your position on the trucker movement and the Canada's COVID response, as well as the cracking down of protesters and the breach of personal freedoms and freedom of speech in Canada, which Canada is quick to police other countries around the world on notions of freedom of expression. Yet we've clearly done our fair share of cracking down on people's right to protest. Um, we've you've also documented the people attending the NATO parliamentary session. You've asked them a question that I feel is super easy to respond to, yet for these NATO members, they clearly have trouble responding to, which is, do Palestinians' lives matter as much as Ukrainian lives? I think it's quite easy to respond, and the answer should be yes. For me, it is. Yet, Dimitri, I don't think a single member responded to you, right?
Right. These are
Did
and
you?
these
Did
are
you?
parliamentarians. These are elected
Yeah.
officials in NATO countries, and not a single one was prepared to say, even with just a single word, that's all it took. And I asked dozens of these people this question, that you know, Palestinian lives are worth as much as Ukrainian lives. Not a single one. It was quite remarkable.
And uh, previously, you've done the same experiment at the Ukrainian. Sorry, there was a conference to send more weapons to Ukraine, or it was like the Future Defense Strategy of Ukraine conference happening in Montreal. You've
It
asked
was
those
three,
same
three,
questions.
yes, 3 weeks before this NATO parliamentary summit, which happened about a week ago. There was another summit in Montreal at the same venue, the Palais de Congrès, which was an international conference on the humanitarian dimension of Ukraine's peace plan. And that was hosted by Canadian Foreign Minister Melanie Joly. And again, I asked that very same question to delegates who came from all over the Western world. And the reaction was a little bit different. Most of them refused to answer. Uh, Two or three of them said, yes, Palestinian lives are worth as much as Ukrainian lives. And two or three of them actually came right out and said, no, they're not, which was quite stunning. So, more or less, it was the same response, just a general, I think, contempt really being exhibited at both of these events for Palestinian life, which is reflective in Western government policy.
Dimitri, we're getting a couple of comments in the chat saying that our voices are a bit low. So I'll try on my own to speak much louder. We're trying these new systems with microphones and everything. We keep improving our streams every now and then. So yeah, we will definitely monitor our voices, make sure that we're heard. And then more recently, Dimitri, I think on Wednesday or so, you spoke to Marwa Osman, and that was moments before the ceasefire was agreed to. She seemed a bit skeptic. We're going to talk a bit more about this later on during the stream. But it was extremely timely to hear this feedback from Marwa. And then Zachary Foster and, of course, Laith Marouf interview that we published yesterday.
Right. Marwa
Um,
is a Lebanese journalist who is unabashedly pro resistance. She spends most of her time in Beirut, but she comes from a border village in Lebanon, South Lebanon, called Hiam. I've interviewed her before. She's interviewed me. She has a program in Beirut when I was in Lebanon. And we talked about the ceasefire. She said she had doubts about whether it would come into effect, but she wanted it to happen for the sake of the Lebanese people. And she revealed for the first time during the interview that she had just learned that Israeli soldiers were occupying her family home in Hiam. And she had some interesting commentary about that. Just before I came onto the program today, I checked in with Marwa to find out if she's been able to recover her family home since the ceasefire went into effect on Wednesday morning. And she told me she has not. She understands that Israeli soldiers are still occupying her house. And today, Israeli soldiers in Hiam demolished two civilian structures. So she doesn't know when she's going to be able to recover her home. She doesn't know if it will be standing when she finally is able to return to her village of Hiam. Is really quite a terrible situation, and our thoughts are with Marwa and her family, and we're hoping she'll be able to uh, return to her house with her family safely very soon.
and just to carry forward with the pressing news that happening this week, which is the ceasefire that was signed between Lebanon and Israel. Laith made sure to emphasize that Hezbollah was not a signatory of this ceasefire. And maybe we could just take a step back and put this whole ceasefire in context. On the 8th of October, the day after October 7th, Hezbollah came in support of the Palestinian resistance by targeting military bases and military assets of the IDF in the northern part of historic Palestine. Hezbollah came in support of the Palestinian people in their quest for national liberation, and the main intention was to divide Israel's capabilities into two fronts and to push Israel to negotiate a settlement with the Palestinians. Hezbollah has very strong military capabilities. Some would argue stronger than Hamas, of course. And Hezbollah was able to put significant pressure on Israel by forcing all the settlers living in the north of Palestine, in Israel, to evacuate deeper south in the center of Israel, or even more southern cities. This has pushed the settlers who used to live in the north, who were displaced, to put pressure on the state of Israel. And then on the 1st of October, Israel launched a ground invasion. And the goal of the ground invasion was to destroy Hezbollah's military capabilities, push them north of the Litani River, and to finally, secure some form of buffer zone that would allow Israeli citizens to go back north. The ceasefire is mainly, it was signed by the state of Lebanon and the state of Israel, with, I believe, France, Germany, the United States as guarantors of this ceasefire. And I could maybe run through some of my understandings of the ceasefire agreement, but it mainly revolves around statements that Israel and Hezbollah will not start another offensive campaign, and that Israel and Lebanon recognizes, and I quote, importance of Resolution 1701. I'll elaborate more on the Resolution 1701 later on. And the ceasefire agreement mentions that the Lebanese army will now enforce or control the weapons coming in and out of Lebanon, as well as ensure that no militias outside of the Lebanese army are positioned and stationed in the south of the Litani River. Now, the Litani River is this river that cuts the south of Lebanon to the more center and northern parts of Lebanon. Now, the Resolution 1701 came as a settlement after the war of 2006 that Hezbollah won. Israel did a ground invasion and was pushed back by Hezbollah. It was seen as a huge military defeat by Ehud Olmert and the Israeli society, and they were forced to negotiate the Resolution 1701 that in some way called for the dismantlement of militias. In that case, they were referring to Hezbollah, and that there would be no presence of soldiers, of militias south of the Litani River. Now, there's not much difference between what Hezbollah agreed to in 2006 and what Hezbollah agreed to earlier this week. In my opinion, I see this as a victory for the Hezbollah movement, or more so a defeat of Israel. And I think my reasoning for understanding this as a defeat for Israel is because Israel was not able to destroy Hezbollah. The goal of the ground invasion was to destroy Hezbollah, and it was not able to do so. It did damage some senior leadership, But Hezbollah is a decentralized movement, meaning that you can impact X and Y branches of the movement, yet it will respawn and reform itself. So while they were able to claim some symbolic victories that they could sell to their own people, they were not able to affect Hezbollah. And moments before the ceasefire, Hezbollah was still targeting tanks and handling heavy blows to Israel. Um, Israel was not able to disarm Hezbollah, which was another one of its objectives, and was not able to do any significant advances in Lebanon. And more importantly, Israel was trying to sell the dream that the settlers will be able to return north back to their homes. And you could read reports from Israeli settlers themselves mentioning that they are extremely reluctant and they do not trust the ceasefire. Hezbollah is in a war of attrition against Israel since 1985, meaning that it is fighting kind of an unconventional war. I don't really see this as a ceasefire. I see this as a truce. Hezbollah is committed to fighting Israel in what you can call death by a million paper cuts. Hezbollah is probably restructuring itself, and in some way, it will be able to do so because the same way it was able to go around the promises that the Resolution 1701 was trying to guarantee. Well, considering that it's the same commitment that it was then that it is now, we can pretty much understand that Hezbollah will return south of the Litani River. And Hezbollah has long-range missile capabilities, meaning that their weapons could be anywhere in Lebanon, and they will still be able to strike the north of Palestine, Israel. And it will still be able to hit any parts of Israel. So I see this as Israel not being able to see any way forward, trying to cut its losses, um, and well, Hezbollah was able to kind of put severe strain on Israel's army, and now we know that Israel is having extreme pressure to draft these ultra-Orthodox into the army because their main reserves and their main military forces is not able to keep up with this kind of fighting. Dimitri, what do you think?
Well, let me start by talking about UN Security Council Resolution 1701, which was adopted, I believe it was unanimously in 2006 to bring an end to the war in South Lebanon. First of all, in my opinion, this is an unjust resolution. It's an unjust resolution primarily because it established a buffer zone in South Lebanon rather than on the territory of Israel, even though it was Israel that was the aggressor and that invaded Lebanon and tried to occupy the south of the country. So I think a reasonable buffer zone would have been on the other side of the border, and that's where the UN, should have been on the side of the aggressor, and that's where the UN forces should have been placed to monitor the behavior of the aggressor and any preparations for further aggressive actions against South Lebanon. But instead, they put the UN force in South Lebanon. Part of the deal was that the Israelis were supposed to withdraw their troops from all parts of Lebanon. They did not do that. And to this very day, including in the Sheba farms, they continue to have troops stationed continuously since the 2006 war, even before then, on territory that really belongs to Lebanon. So because, and of course the Israelis breached the ceasefire in 2006 many times by attacking Israel or Lebanon with their air force. They have complete, almost complete air dominance, and they use that repeatedly to violate the ceasefire. And so the Islamic resistance in Lebanon never actually withdrew its military forces from South Lebanon. They've continued to be there continuously. The UNIFIL has not been able to disarm them. The Lebanese army has not been able to disarm them. I don't think either of them has made any serious effort to disarm them because they're too powerful. And they enjoy too much support amongst the population of South Lebanon. And And furthermore, the UNIFIL was supposed to be monitoring the movement of civilians across the Litani River, which is, I think, about 25 kilometers north of the border between Lebanon and Israel. And I can tell you, certainly within the past year, that people could cross those bridges across the Litani River from, into South Lebanon without any scrutiny by UNIFIL, because I did it myself on numerous occasions. I went across the Litani River accompanied by my guide and fixer from Lebanon without ever encountering at the at the Litani River any UN personnel. I did see UN personnel, you know, uh, across, driving across and inspecting various sites in South Lebanon, but they were not uh, exercising any meaningful constraint over who could cross the Litani River. In any event, 1701 has been, in many ways, been a dead letter from the beginning because, in my opinion, Israel never intended to respect it and did not respect it. And so the Islamic resistance was not going to comply with its terms either. And now the references to 1701 are mostly a cover for the military reality. The military reality is that Israel, for the reasons you've articulated, its military has yet again been defeated in South Lebanon. And you don't have to believe me and Rami, for that, the truth of that proposition. Just look at what the polls are saying in Israel. Channel 13 did a poll which showed that 61% of respondents in Israel said that Israel did not win this war. And only 26% said that it did. And there was another poll which showed similar numbers. A huge proportion of the Israeli population does not believe that Israel won this war despite its overwhelming air superiority and all of the backing that it receives from the collective West, which has, collectively a military budget that is several times the combined military budget of China and Russia. So it's quite a defeat for Israel. And I think that there is a serious question about whether it will hold the ceasefire. But I don't think we can really talk meaningfully about the ceasefire without talking about what is also happening in Syria. I think there is very likely to be a relationship between those two things. And so I'd suggest, Rami, we focus on that now, maybe give people some important context for the ceasefire in Lebanon.
But just before we switch, the ceasefire agreement also gives Israel the right to attack and in some way enforce the ceasefire. But I also see it as a scapegoat a bit to claim some sort of victory, because, well, for the same reason Israel signed the ceasefire is the same reason why it wouldn't want to interfere again in Lebanon and bomb Hezbollah targets south of the Litani River. Also, that I know there was a lot of concern about the specific point in the ceasefire agreement that, well, why are we allowing Israel to engage in these military acts as part of the ceasefire agreement? Well, the reality as well is that whether this clause is in the ceasefire agreement or not, Israel doesn't follow the rules and will intervene in south of Lebanon the same way it has historically, right?
Yeah.
So this was just one little thought of mine. Now, Dimitri, I think it was on November the 28th, it came a bit as a shock to see Aleppo fall, or there's a lot of misinformation or conflicting information coming out. Um, we know that, well, the HTS, Hayat Tahrir Sham, which is which is a terrorist organization that receives funding from Turkey and the United States, and was created from a merger of a dozen or so other terrorist organizations back in 2018, went on the offensive just a few days after the ceasefire in Lebanon was signed. And they went ahead and, well, left Homs and, well, were able to put pressure on Aleppo. Most recent reports are saying that the Syrian Arab Army temporarily evacuated its forces from Aleppo and are coming in from outside. And then there's more recent reports saying that now um, the the rebels, the terrorists, are now going towards Hama, which is on the south of Homs. Um, the timing, as you've mentioned, right? It's difficult to speak about this without talking about the ceasefire in Lebanon. It seems like these two are linked. Whether it is Israel activating their terrorist cells in Syria, or it's the Syrian terrorists, well, these terrorists from abroad mostly, right? They're coming from the Islamic world around, or even from Europe. Not many of them are Syrian, to say the very least. But these people clearly decided that the best time to engage in their uh, their their overthrow of Aleppo and of Hama was to be a few days after the ceasefire. Um, how do you interpret this, Dimitri?
Why don't we start by pulling up the map of the region, Rami?
Yes,
I
yes.
think this provides important context.
Might take me a bit of time, Dimitri. So let's start with this one over here. Um, yeah, Dimitri, I'm having technical issues over here pulling up that image. Um,
Okay, while we're waiting for Rami to do that, um, let's talk a little bit about the uh, the primary suspect in this attack on Aleppo, the second largest city in Syria, in the northwest of the country. So the group that is primarily responsible for this charge is called Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, or HTS, which in English means the Organization for the Liberation of the Levant. And this organization traces its beginnings to the outset of the Syrian war. And in May 2018, the group was added to the U.S. State Department's existing designation of its predecessor, the Al-Qaeda affiliate Jabhat al-Nusra, as a foreign terrorist organization. So the HST, even the American government admits that this is a terrorist organization.
Dimitri,
And
we have the image up.
great. So let me just pause there. So we're starting with a larger map of West Asia, and as you can see here, and we're gonna show you a close up of the area where the attack is occurring in Syria. But right now, we're just going to start with this larger map, so you can see that Iran, in order for it to supply the Islamic resistance in Lebanon, and there's no question that a lot of the military supplies that the Islamic resistance in Lebanon employs is coming from Iran. It's absolutely crucial logistically for the sustenance of the resistance in Lebanon that it be supplied by Iran. So for that to happen, because none of those weapons are going to be able to pass through Turkey. Turkey is hostile to Iran and to Hezbollah. And I would go as far as to say the Palestinian people. We'll get back to that in a moment. So the weaponry would have to pass, if it's whether it's going by land or by air, through Iraq, whose government is now, as a result of the overthrow of Saddam Hussein, uh, is now sympathetic towards Iran. And Iraq is a fairly large country. Even if the Iraqi military or government were minded to impede the flow of weapons to Hezbollah, and I really doubt that they are, it would be difficult for them to do that because of the state of their military and the state of the country and the size of the country. But in any event, the weapons have to flow through Iraq and then through Syria and then into Lebanon. So this supply chain, sustaining it, is critical to the survival of Lebanon. But it's also very important for the government in Syria. Without the support of Iran, it itself receives support from Iran. That is extremely important to its ability to resist attempts by the West and its proxies in the region to install a pro-Western government in Damascus. So now, can we pull up the map of Syria? Okay, so
Yep.
this is a map that was published, I think it was today, by Al Jazeera. And before I get into this, this map, I just want to say a few words about Al Jazeera. You know, Al Jazeera, let us not forget, it's always important to remember that it is controlled by the Qatari elite. Qatar is unquestionably aligned with the United States. The largest U.S. military base in West Asia is in the United States. I was in Qatar earlier this year. While I was there, I just happened to learn that there was a huge military exposition. I attended it. All the major Western arms manufacturers were there, hobnobbing with dignitaries from Qatar. I went out to the military base, this gigantic military base, which is about a 45-minute drive outside of the city, the main city in Qatar. There's just no question that this is a regime that is aligned with the United States, and therefore any media organization controlled by this regime, as Al Jazeera is, one would expect that it is going to be pro-Western in its coverage. And a lot of people get confused about this because, you know, Al Jazeera, relative to any major corporate media outlet in the West, is very sympathetic to the Palestinian cause. And its coverage is far superior to that of any corporate media outlet in the West. But that doesn't mean that Al Jazeera isn't influenced by the agenda of its masters. It is, even though there are individual reporters there who are very committed to telling the truth about Palestine and Israel. Some of them have given their lives, including Shireen Abu Akleh, a Palestinian-American journalist who was shot by an Israeli sniper last year. At the leadership level of the organization, there are serious questions about its objectivity. So, for example, its reporting on the Ukraine war is virtually a carbon copy of what you'll find in any major Western media outlet. And it is also hostile, frankly, to the resistance groups, particularly Iran and Hezbollah. So in any event, there's a little bit of a reflection about that in this map. This big yellow section you see in the upper right-hand corner, this is identified by Al Jazeera. If you look in the, you know, the box in the upper third of this map, it shows, it's got a, you know, the colors, it says what they mean. And the yellow, it says, represents Kurdish and Syrian democratic forces. This is the area that's pretty much controlled by the United States. Okay, it doesn't say anything about the fact that in this area there is an illegal U.S. military occupation. And furthermore, what are they doing in this area? They're stealing oil. They're stealing Syrian oil. And I understand some of this oil, maybe even all of it, is going to Israel. And Donald Trump himself, during his first administration, admitted that they were there, the U.S. troops were there to take the oil. So this area, this yellow area you see in this map, is being illegally occupied by the United States and its proxies, and they are stealing Syrian oil. And then if you go over to the upper left-hand corner of this map, which is northwestern Syria, you'll see a light green region which includes the city of Idlib. Now this area is where HTS is based, the city of Idlib, and it is backed by Turkey, Qatar, and the Saudis. And there too, Turkey has actually established military bases in this area. Turkey as well is illegally occupying this area. And then if you go down to the lower left-hand corner of the map, you're going to see a blue strip of land near the edge of the map. That is the Golan Heights. That too is part of Syria, and it is being illegally occupied by the Israelis. And in fact, the Israelis have annexed it. They claim to have annexed it under their domestic law, and the Trump administration blessed that illegal annexation, which almost the whole international community says is a violation of the UN Charter and of international law. And the Biden administration, when it came to power, did nothing about this. It did not go back to the position of the U.S. government for over decades that you know, this land actually belonged to Syria. It just acquiesced in Donald Trump's uh, approval of Israeli annexation of the Syrian land. So you have three parts of Syria that are being illegally occupied, and in one case, not only occupied, but annexed by the US, Turkey, and Israel. And every one of these countries is aligned with Ukraine in the Ukraine war. And they are all saying that the borders of a sovereign state are inviolable, and that any attempt to change the borders of a state by uh, force are inadmissible under the United Nations Charter. Well, my friends, that's exactly what they are doing to Syria. And not just to Syria, they're doing it to Palestine, and they're doing it to other parts of the world as well. These same champions of international law and the inviolability of the borders of a sovereign state are themselves serial violators of sovereignty. And I cannot stress this enough. Whatever you think of Bashar al-Assad, and I readily accept and agree that there are many criticisms, legitimate criticisms to be made of his government, including from a human rights perspective. The fact is that his government is the internationally recognized government of Syria. And that means that its refusal to consent to the presence of American, Turkish, and Israeli troops on its land uh, renders those occupations illegal, a violation of the UN Charter. However, and precisely because it is the internationally recognized government of Syria, whatever you may think of it, if it invites Iranian forces or forces of Hezbollah onto its soil, or forces from the Iraqi popular militias onto its soil to help defend it from an incursion, that is its right under international law. And the presence of those troops on its soil, if it's done with the consent of the internationally recognized government, is not illegal. It's not a violation of international law. Again, whatever you may think of the government of Bashar al-Assad. Now, I just want to focus, um, Rami, on the part of the map. I don't know if you're able to zoom in where Idlib is situated. Um, are you able to zoom in on that? Is that possible?
I think that's the
Great.
most I could. Oh, I could do a bit more.
That's
Yeah.
good. That's perfect. Thank you very much. Now, I'm sorry. Yeah, that's it. Just there. Thank you very much. So the part that is that has the diagonal lines running through it, this is the area that HTS has managed to seize in the last few days. So to the left, where it's just a solid light green, that's where these forces were confined, I think going all the way back to 2020 under arrangements negotiated between the Russian government and the Syrian government and Turkey and so forth. But they've broken that arrangement, and now they have taken Aleppo, or large parts of Aleppo, and critically, they have moved south towards Hama. Now, what is important about this southward incursion towards Hama? And by the way, I understand that it's very hard to know exactly what's going on, but it appears that the Syrian army has effectively halted their advance on the outskirts of Hama. But they're clearly trying to go south. Now, why are they doing that? Why are they heading south? Why aren't they trying to enter into, for example, the area that is controlled by the Americans, where there's oil, which presumably they would be able to profit from? Why are they heading south? Well, I think the most plausible explanation of this is they're heading south because if they are able to create a barrier between the areas controlled by Syria's government, which is friendly to Hezbollah, and Lebanon, then it is going to be very difficult, or much more difficult, for Iran to resupply Hezbollah. And I would suggest to you that that's exactly what this is all about. And another indicator of what's going on here is that this offensive, this assault, which violated pre-existing agreements, happened at the very moment that the ceasefire went into effect in Lebanon. So I think the fair reading of all of these events is that there was quite possibly a secret deal between the Americans and the Turks, who effectively control HTS. They supply HTS in the Idlib region. They arm HTS. They are aligned with HTS. This is a Turkish-American proxy. and a Qatari proxy and Saudi proxy. They all supported Idlib, the HTS terrorist group in the Idlib region. What they're trying to do, they're coordinating with Israel at the very moment that Israel agreed to stop the attacks because it was unable to take South Lebanon by force. They are conspiring to create an impediment to the delivery of weapons to Hezbollah, which undoubtedly is going to want to replenish its weapon stocks in the months ahead before Donald Trump takes power. In effect, Erdogan, the Turkish president, whose fiery rhetoric would lead you to believe that he is a supporter of the Palestinian cause, in my opinion, is very likely collaborating with the genocidal Israeli regime. And he may have his own, you know, um, selfish reasons for doing that. It may not be that he particularly cares about, empowering Israel. It may just be that he wants to establish his government as a player in the region in advance of what a lot of people think is going to be a U.S. withdrawal from Syria. A lot of people think when Trump takes office, he may withdraw Syrian troops or American troops from Syria. And so there are people out there, intelligent geopolitical analysts, who are suggesting that this is kind of like a beauty pageant where, Erdogan is demonstrating to the Americans what a reliable partner he can be by launching this offensive at a key moment, which is effectively saving Israel's ass, to be perfectly blunt about it. And another thing I want to say about this HTS group is that there have been admissions by the Israeli government. This was the Al-Nusra Front back in the early days of the Syrian war. And, they changed their name to HTS because they wanted to try to distance themselves. But even Western observers continue to acknowledge that HTS is aligned with Al-Qaeda in many ways and is a terrorist organization. If these people actually are so concerned, these HTS terrorists, with the well-being of Muslims and Arabs and the crimes being committed against them by the West and its proxies, why haven't they ever attacked Israel? Why is Israel giving them support? It was treating their wounded soldiers. It was providing economic aid to them. These were admissions by the Israeli regime. It was even providing them with light arms. I think the fair assumption here is that this is not some kind of militant group that is opposed to Western hegemony in the region. These are a bunch of crazed, lunatic mercenaries who have put themselves in the service of Western powers to try to perpetuate and entrench Western hegemony in the region. That's who they really are. If they actually cared about the Palestinian people, why would they be taking military actions which favor Israel? Because those military actions will jeopardize the ability of Iran to resupply Hezbollah, which has actually been fighting Israel more so than any other resistance group outside of Palestine in the last year. I think that that's likely what's going on. And this week, we're going to explore this further. I'm going to have onto our program, we're going to have a big week ahead of us. We're going to have Dr. Gilbert Doctorow, based in Brussels, an expert in Russia. He'll be on the program. We're going to have Matthew Ho, who we previously had Matthew in the program, a former U.S. Marine captain who just returned from a 8-day trip to Palestine. We're going to have Kevork Almasian of Syriana Analysis, who's actually from Aleppo and has family members in Aleppo right now. He's been reporting extensively on what's going on there. And we're going to have former CIA analyst Larry Johnson on the program as well this week. And so we're going to explore more deeply into what is happening in Syria and why ultimately the West and Israel agreed to this ceasefire in Lebanon.
Dimitri, just something we kind of we didn't really dive too deep into is that just before the ceasefire in Lebanon was signed, Netanyahu was already priming us for war with Syria. We saw an escalation and an increased amount of bombing happening in Damascus on Syrian Arab army positions. We've also heard Netanyahu say that Bashar al-Assad is provoking and being aggressive. Um, it's hard to understand what would make Netanyahu say this, considering he started 3 wars already, if not more, since October 7th. But there was a status quo happening in Syria for the last few years, and that was maybe keeping a balance between Homs and Aleppo, a retreat of militias and forces in some not so very well defined border. But now that HTS broke the status quo and Turkey providing them support, um, people are seeing that this could be an opportunity for Syria to go over with a counterattack and bring a settlement to this well, a new status quo that would be much more favorable for the Syrian government.
Hmm.
We're seeing that now the Russian army, the Russian Air Force is providing air support to Syria. We know that Israel will most likely not dare to engage with Russian Air Force. Um, we know that right now, I believe Russian Air Force is operating in Aleppo as well as the highway connecting Hama and Homs, and that could. I mean, I think there's many people being hopeful a of what the new status quo would look like in this region. Now, one thing that is particularly, I think, it's nothing new for us and that is analyzing this region, but Turkey has always come and support the Palestinians in empty wards. These empty wards were mostly targeted to Muslims around the world to come out as a prominent force and a speaker of Muslims. But we note that in the middle of a genocide, that's well, from October 7th to now on, Israel has provided no military support to the Palestinian people. Yet, in the uprising that has happened since October 7th, Turkey has found the strength to support terrorists in Syria. So it's not about not being able to do so, it's Turkey actively deciding where it wants to operate and which bridges it wants to burn down. And I mean, I was maybe fooled by Turkey in the past, but I know that it's a lot more visible now that Turkey is a backstabbing player in the region, and that's why I think you're noticing more and more Palestinian factions or political parties now siding closer with Bashar al-Assad and not putting their eggs in the Turkish basket because they know that these Turkish words do never materialize. I'm seeing people in the chat saying Erdogan is a closet Zionist. I would say that he's not even a closet anymore. He is clearly a Zionist because not only can he come to the defense of the Palestinians using weapons, he can turn off the valve of the gas pipeline going from Azerbaijan to Israel. That's that's the least that we would expect from Turkey, and it's not even materializing on that front. But it is able to send tanks, heavy machinery, heavy weapons to HTS. We know that Turkey is buying oil and gas from ISIS, and in doing so, it is funding the capabilities of the terrorists in Syria to commit more beheadings, more destruction against the Syrian people.
Yeah. I
Um,
just want to say, Rami, I'm a Greek citizen. I spend a good bit of time in Greece. There's a lot of, let's just lay it out there. There's a lot of hostility amongst the Greek population towards Turkey for historical reasons. I don't share that hostility at all. I view the people of Turkey as our brothers and sisters, and I think we have common interests. Many, we have much to share historically, culturally, um, and I have been every bit as critical of the Greek government and the Cypriot government, the Greek Cypriot government, who are unabashedly pro-Israel. I'm just absolutely appalled, and I've spent a lot more time condemning them than I have spent condemning the behavior of Erdogan. This has nothing to do with the fact that Erdogan is the leader of Turkey. This has to do with the fact that Erdogan is a fraud. Erdogan is a blowhard. Ultimately, Erdogan is not a friend of the Palestinian people any more than the government of Greece or the Greek Cypriot government is a Palestinian friend. These people are all enemies of justice. They do not represent the interests or desires of the peoples of the region, who are overwhelmingly pro-Palestine and pro-justice and anti-imperialist, and they want the Americans and their tyrannical vassals out of the region once and for all. So this has nothing to do with nationalism. I just want to assure people of that. I would love to be able to say that Erdogan is standing up for Palestinian rights. He has the capacity, he has the military and economic capacity to help them. But he's obviously, I think we now can see beyond a shadow of a doubt, that he is aligned with the United States and the genocidal Israeli regime, whatever his rhetoric may be.
Definitely. Now, with the situation going on in Syria, we note that his mandate is ending quite soon. In January, in around a month or so, Trump will be inaugurating. And we note that currently Biden is in a last resort to create a new status quo, a new mess, a bigger mess for Trump to fix. That's what we're seeing with these escalations happening in Syria. But also, most recently, on the 28th of November in Georgia, there has been as well some massive uprisings that have been happening there, mainly to create a new Maidan in Georgia. I was in Georgia early in October to document the elections that were happening there. The elections happened on the 26th of October. The basically was an election where the Georgian Dream, a political party which is in some way pragmatic, a government that is ruled by technocrats, um, which was the incumbent party, right? The party that was governing the country, ended up winning these elections on the 26th of October, 2024. And as soon as the election results came out, the West, France, the United States, Germany, the EU, all came out at the same time condemning the results in Georgia, claiming that there were some election irregularities, electoral fraud, all these claims that are not backed by any facts. We know, Dimitri, that every time elections don't go NATO's way, we immediately get slapped with the Russian meddling, Russian um, disinformation, and of course that there are electoral irregularities because no one would ever vote against Western interests. And this is what ended up happening in Georgia. I spoke to many Georgians who were not convinced by by what the European Union was promising. The European Union wants Georgia to join for reasons that benefit the European Union and with the intention of harming Russia by suffocating Russia even more, by imposing blockades and more sanctions on Russia. And Georgia's main trading partner is Russia. They had a war back in 2008, which resulted in the territorial disputes in Abkhazia and South Ossetia, which are still going on right now. And even at the height of tensions between Russia and Georgia, Georgia never put in place drastic sanctions on Russia. And that is because it would hurt them more than it would hurt Russia themselves. The goal of NATO and the EU is to get Georgia to join NATO and EU, and then hopefully open a second front on Russia. And basically, Georgia would find itself in the same position that the Ukrainians are in right now. The president of Georgia, which is a position that is appointed by the parliament, decided that she wouldn't leave her presidential office when her mandate ends, because she claims that the presidential body, the presidential office, is the only position is the only independent position in Georgia, and all the others have been corrupted by Georgian Dream. So she also started an assembly or a committee of all opposition parties and decided that they themselves together will take control of Georgia. And in some way, we could see that she is openly advocating for a coup and to disregard the elections, the voice of the people. As much as people want to say that the elections were fraudulent, of course, if you go to Tbilisi, many people will speak against Georgian Dream, but the population of Tbilisi is less than 1.5 million. And many citizens in Tbilisi are actually Russians, defectors or dissidents, as well as Ukrainians. These people don't have the right to vote. You speak to people outside of Tbilisi in the villages and outside of big cities, they will all speak greatly in favor of Georgian Dream. And with her wanting to do a coup, she's openly calling for like civil disobedience and a Maidan, a revolution in Georgia. And in doing so, she has found support from NATO, from the EU, and right now, under extreme pressure and the threat of sanctions, many ambassadors and government officials have been resigning from their own positions. Now, I've been to Georgia. I've did a report for this channel that you could see, and I've seen how the police has shown extreme restraint, right? Dimitri, we've been to protests in Montreal, in Europe. You'll see weaponized police officers who will shoot tear gas the moment they have the opportunity to do so, beat protesters. Every time I've been to Georgia, I've never witnessed police officers having weapons on them. In Montreal, you'll see riot police with horses and tanks that were passed down from the Canadian Army used to crack down on protests. And there's just one footage that I want to show here of protesters setting the parliament on fire. This is on Rustaveli, a main street. I'm just going to share this clip over here. This is the parliament. This is where the representatives of the people speak in, where laws are made. There's no police protecting the parliament. There are protesters torching the parliament to the ground. So what we're witnessing right now is that the Georgian Dream, the Georgian government, is in a tough position because it knows that any actions it will take will be weaponized by the West. We've already got the usual suspects, Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, these Western splinter cells operating around the world, have been condemning the police. Now, the police is in a tough situation in Georgia because it either lets its parliament be burnt to the ground or it has to fight back protesters and then be criticized in the West. Now, Georgian Dream has been anticipating these types of behaviors. It knows that nonprofits and Western organizations have been working against Georgian interest within Georgia. That's why it passed the foreign agent law. And for all those people that were wondering, why would Georgia ever pass a foreign agent law? Well, now you see, because the Georgian youth has been corrupted into believing in this illusion of freedom that is guaranteed by NATO and the European Union, and then you have your parliament being burnt down. It's extremely disappointing what we're seeing there. I'm keeping touch with the people I've interviewed to have updates on how do they see this developing. It's extremely critical times. We know that this is the neocons in Biden's administration that are trying to pass on a tougher job for Trump to fix. And he also has neocons in his administration that might amplify what we're seeing in Georgia. And that's additional pressure or a additional concern for Russia that it needs to mitigate with Western groups operating in Georgia to create the downfall of their neighboring country, that will then use this opportunity to join NATO, join the European Union, and what it seems like want to open a second front, which the Georgian Dream refused to do so after the special military operation started in Ukraine.
Yeah, there's no reason to think that the timing of this is coincidental to the events in Syria. Uh, I think the rational assumption is that the West is trying to destabilize Georgia at the same time as it is trying to destabilize Syria because it is having its ass handed to it in the war in Ukraine. The Ukrainian military is being destroyed systematically. Russian forces are advancing at numerous points along the immense line of contact. The Ukrainian energy system lies in smoking ruins as winter approaches. They're now so desperate that they're being pressured, the Ukrainians, into lowering the age for conscription from 25 to 18. It's the Americans who are pressuring them to do that. Um, what is happening here, folks, is that the West is escalating a global hybrid war against its geopolitical rivals because it has not been able to achieve, by means of military actions in Ukraine and economic sanctions on Russia, uh, the, uh, the entrenchment of U.S. global hegemony. So we're seeing this conflict expand through a variety of proxies and tactics. We are in a world war. The eminent French anthropologist Emmanuel Todd expressed that view in early 2023, before the genocide began in Gaza, before these events began to unfold in Georgia, before the revival of the military conflict in Syria. And now he's being proven to have been prophetic. This is a world war, and no one should have any illusions about that. And it's very clear, that states are marshaling their forces, economic and military forces, for one side and the other. On the other one side, you have, the main players in the BRICS, the non-Western world, who are fed up with global hegemony. On the other side, you have the United States and its various vassals and proxies, primarily in the West, but also in some parts of the non-Western world. And they are beginning to apply all of the tools at their disposal, economic, political, disinformational, military, in order to weaken the other side. And the war is very important, is both intensifying and expanding geographically. And we as citizens need to rise to the occasion to bring this to an end. We did this during the Vietnam War. The protests against the Vietnam War, which were far more persistent and intense than what we've seen for the most part in the West up until now, did play an important role in bringing an end to that war. In this war, the stakes are much higher because our primary so-called enemy, Russia, has enough nukes to destroy the world many times over, whereas Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia did not have any nukes to defend themselves. So the stakes are much higher. The amount of death and destruction that's being deployed every day is comparable, if not even worse, than what we've seen in the Second World War. Just look what they've done to Gaza. What they've done to Gaza rivals any, destruction of an urban center that we saw during the Second World War. It's even arguably as horrible as what we saw when the Americans used atomic weapons on Nagasaki and Hiroshima. So these stakes are extraordinarily high. And what I find amazing, Rami, is that, there's been so little protest against the proxy war in Ukraine, even though it should be clear to any of us that Western governments are not there to protect the human rights of the Ukrainians. They're not there to enforce international law. Just look at what they're doing in West Asia. These people don't give a damn about international law and human rights. They don't care about democracy. This is all about their power. And they're imperiling the future of our children to augment and sustain their power. So I'm going to repeat something that I said in my discussions this week, particularly with Laith Marouf. We need to up our game in the West. We need to apply far more pressure than we have up until now. Whatever it is that's upsetting you at this particular moment can't possibly be as important as the destruction of the human species, in my opinion. So if something's working you up and you're not worked up about the risk of nuclear war, I think you need to revisit your priorities.
And Dimitri, I think this comes back to your report that you've done in Montreal, where you've asked these NATO parliamentary members, do Palestinian lives equal as much as Ukrainian lives? When countries join NATO, they become NATO. And when you become NATO, the lives of Serbs, the lives of Palestinians, the lives of Iraqis, of Libyans, of Afghans, of Pakistanis becomes irrelevant. And this is where our opposition to NATO comes from. There's nothing wrong with defense alliances if it's purely defensive, but these alliances are purely created to spread American hegemony and expand American markets and to remove any um, opponents, or not even opponents, but in some cases, friction in America's objective of expanding its control and dominance over the world. So yes, I mean, it's extremely tragic what we're seeing in Georgia, and to the very least, you would expect them to learn from what happened in Ukraine. The Ukrainian people right now, I mean, there was a member of parliament in Ukraine, I forgot the name, it's just coming, he spoke against, well, didn't even speak against Zelensky, he offered Zelensky the opportunity to negotiate peace with Russia, and was prosecuted, and now he's in prison. You would people in Ukraine themselves are not as united around the front that is open right now with Russia. And you're getting Georgians right now, younger Georgians. I would also argue many of them are not even Georgians themselves. They're Ukrainian, they're Russian dissidents. They are French people. I personally know French people in Georgia right now protesting. You would expect them to protest their own governments, but no, they find better opportunities abroad, right? Because the whole world needs to change, but not them themselves. So you would expect these Georgians to learn and not want to have the same fate as Ukraine. But this, I think, just shows the extent of American propaganda. And as much as we need to resist NATO, we also need to depropagandize ourselves. There's nothing good coming out of NATO. We are complicit in NATO's crimes around the world. And
Yeah,
yeah, we
Rami,
need
I
to.
think that's such an important thing you said. We have to depropagandize ourselves. You know, a lot of us out there, I know a lot of people who watch this show, are keenly aware of the fact that there is a propaganda system in the West and that it's done immense damage. But there are times I think a lot of our comrades in the anti-imperialist movement, and I've been guilty of this myself. I've discovered after the fact, up until very recently, in many respects, how I myself have continued to be under the influence of this propaganda system. And every day I'm awakening to the ways in which it has affected my views about the world. Never underestimate the power and sophistication of the Western propaganda system. It is the most powerful, sophisticated, nefarious, insidious model of propaganda that humanity has ever seen. It is extraordinarily complex. And the ways in which it affects our thinking and our views about the world, even those of us who know it exists and who are determined to cleanse ourselves of its influence, I think at times, and I include myself in this, are not fully aware of the extent and nature of its influence over us. So we have to continuously be self-critical. And I think the Ukraine war is a perfect example of how the Western propaganda system has continued to poison the minds of people in the West, even people who are broadly speaking aware of its existence. Because, as I said, there's so little opposition even now to our government's policies towards the Ukraine war. We have to bring that war to an end. There's absolutely no justification for people being complacent about this. This is imperiling the future of our children, and the war is spreading.
And Dimitri, I think similarly on that note of decolonizing ourselves, I remember in university, my first year of university, I was around the peak of the Syrian civil war, of the Syrian war. Let's just call it that way. Not sure how much of a civil war it is at this point. I remember falling in the trap of believing that Bashar al-Assad is this authoritarian leader killing his people for no reason at all. And those biases often come from the fact that in Canada, we're often surrounded ourselves with forms of diaspora that go against the will of their own people back home. So we meet, I mean, the Syrians that I met, although they're generally good people at the heart, but when it comes to speaking geopolitics wise, they inherit the politics of their parents. And in many times, are intentionally or unintentionally supporting terrorist groups in Syria. The same way, I mean, in when we look in the situation in Venezuela, right? The people that come to Canada are oftentimes not representatives of the will of the people back home. And there's something that we haven't spoke too much about, but it is that the that in some way, when related to the topic of de-propagandizing ourselves, well, the topic of the Uyghur genocide is coming up again all of a sudden, and we heard that Uniqlo, this well, reputable Japanese clothing company, has decided to stop using Uyghur cotton. Volkswagen, I believe, this divested from its factories in Xinjiang, and that's part of this whole process of manufacturing consent for war or for some uprising in with the Uyghur people in Xinjiang. And we know that that's not the will of the the people of Xinjiang, the Uyghur people back there, but this whole committee of these exiled Uyghurs that are parroting, well, that are creating or accepting to propagate American propaganda related to China. And many of us are unfortunately falling for that trap of the Uyghur genocide claims. I have the intention of going to China and to investigate this with my own eyes, all of these claims. I know there's already a lot of these claims that we can debunk just by opening Google Maps and just doing a quick investigation using open source tools. But then again, we're in a state of where the West wants direct confrontation with China and Russia. And I'm hopeful that in this time, right, because we're in this new Cold War, but this time I don't think there's going to be a division between Russia and China, and they're going to be much more united, and that's going to be a tougher front for for the United States to uh, to take down. Now, Dimitri, should we open up for Q&A?
Yeah,
I'm just going to put
I
this
just want
little
to say
state. Yeah.
two quick things about what you just mentioned before we turn it over to the Q&A. Back when the Canadian Parliament voted, I think it was about 2 years ago, for a resolution condemning China for committing allegedly genocide in Xinjiang, I actually spent 2 weeks of my life examining the record of a parliamentary committee, the International Committee on Human Rights, that had examined this issue. And there were two sessions over a period of 2 years where they took testimony from dozens of witnesses, asked them questions after they took their testimony. And I read the transcripts of all of these testimonies and all of the questioning. I also called the clerk of the parliamentary committee to ask him various questions, and I personally called some of the witnesses who had testified and alleged that the government of China was committing genocide in Xinjiang. And the conclusion that I came to, I believe in the presumption of innocence, and I'm particularly skeptical when the allegations are being made against a geopolitical rival of the West by Western governments. The conclusion I came to is that there could be significant human rights violations taking place in Xinjiang by the Chinese government or elements of the Chinese government against the Uyghur people. But it's unclear what the nature and extent of those violations are. And furthermore, there have been documented terrorist attacks committed by extremists from the Uyghur community in that part of the country. And the evidence supporting the genocide allegation was extraordinarily weak, extraordinarily weak. So I can't sit here and tell you, and I'll say exactly the same thing about Assad. I'm not going to sit here and tell you that Assad is a human rights angel, or that the Chinese government has a spotless record of compliance with human rights law. What I will tell you is that the evidence of the allegations that have been laid at their feet is, in many cases, thin to non-existent when you look at it carefully. And at the end of the day, whatever you may think of these governments, the government of China, the government of Assad, the government of Russia, we should be able to walk and chew gum at the same time and be able to say, look, perhaps a lot of the criticism directed at them is justified, but that doesn't mean we're going to side with the West, that we're going to support the West pro-war, pro-genocide, pro-imperialist, pro-colonialist policies. You can be critical of these governments if you feel that's justified, these non-Western governments, while at the same time recognizing the utter depravity and the extreme recklessness of our own government's foreign policies. So I think we need to be very careful about separating these two issues. What is our government
And
trying to accomplish on the one hand, and what is the truth about the human rights record of those governments? These are two separate issues, and we should keep them separate in our minds.
Dimitri, for the case of the recognition of the Uyghur genocide in Canada, which although it's non-binding, I just want to say that the Canadian government was very quick to recognize a genocide in Xinjiang with no video or image footage
And
of
no,
that so-called genocide.
and no judgment from the ICJ that China was plausibly committing genocide, which we have in this
Precisely.
case. Yeah.
And in the case of Gaza, which I believe there's we're saying that it's the best documented genocide happening in the world, the Canadian government has been extremely silent and didn't do well. It's doing its due process, or God knows what it's doing. But for China, it has been super quick. The genocide has been recognized over a quick week. And I know the person that is spearheading the member of parliament that is spearheading the Uyghur genocide claims in the Canadian Parliament. His name is Samir Zuberi. I know him because he went to Concordia. He would often stop by my office at the SPHR, the Solidarity for Palestinian Human Rights Group at Concordia office, and we became friends. And at some point, he calls me, and during the middle of the pandemic, and he apologizes for going on two paid trips. He started off by saying one paid trip to Israel, using this Shalom Hartman grant, which is called the Muslim Initiative Plan, which funds Muslims to go to Israel on this paid trip where they meet IDF soldiers and Israeli Knesset members. And he confessed to me about that trip and in some way apologized. And I told him, this is very disingenuous. You're probably doing this because you want to end up in the Canadian Parliament. He promised that that was not the case. And then 2 or 3 months later, he ran for seat in Parliament. I was surprised because I was expecting him to run for the NDP, because I thought, well, that's what you do, right? He ended up running for the Liberals. And he's been quite quiet on the case of Palestine in Parliament. He knows that the people of West Island, his community, want him to do more on Palestine. So he goes up now and then on these resolutions to recognize a two-state solution, and does all this liberal work, basically whitewashing Canada. At the end of the day, he's not doing anything in support of Palestine. If anything, he is whitewashing Canada's crimes against the Palestinian people. So additionally, a lot of these claims, there's a report by Max Blumenthal and the Gray Zone, which investigates Adrian Zen's claims of genocide in Xinjiang. And as part of one of Adrian Zen's claims is that China is installing how do you call it? These UDIs, well, these tools to infertilize, to sterilize women in Xinjiang, and by doing so, they're saying that the calculation was done so poorly in Adrian's report that, according to Max Blumenthal's calculation, every woman was sterilized 3 times in China, in Xinjiang. There's a lot of these claims that are just absurd, that is being spread about Xinjiang.
Even
And
Zen,
additionally,
who testified
yeah,
before the Canadian Parliament, he's just a complete clown. Amazing they take this
he's
man seriously.
Islamophobe.
Yes,
He
absolutely. He's
the
a
only
far
Muslims
right
he
lunatic.
respects.
Yeah.
The only Muslims he respects are the Uyghurs. He came out in support of the genocide in Palestine. And then additionally, I was in Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan, which is kind of this region that they like to call East Turkestan. And there's a sizable Uyghur minority there. A lot of them are great people, of course. I got along with many of them. But when you go into the Kazakh, in the metro system in Almaty, there is heavy security, because their terrorist threats aren't coming from Russia or China. It's coming from the Uyghurs themselves. Not, of course, the Uyghur population, but these groups that claim to fight for Uyghur self-determination in a state that they want to create, called East Turkestan. So Of course, the America will find its proxies around the world to create instability.
Mhm.
In Russia, post-Soviet era, it was the Chechens. Now in China, it's going well. In China, it changes every month. It will be the Taiwanese, Hong Kong, the Tibetan people, or Xinjiang that
Mhm.
are being instrumentalized to balkanize China the same way they tried to balkanize Russia,
Mhm.
the same way they actually balkanized, sadly, Yugoslavia.
Yeah. I just want to conclude my thought. Not even Zent's Rami claims that the Chinese government or military have massacred tens of thousands of Uyghurs through, bombardment, starvation, or whatever. And no one has attempted to produce any kind of physical evidence that the Chinese government is engaged in that sort of thing. The allegations are actually much less extreme than they are in the case of Israel. And in the case of Israel, we have a mountain of eyewitness testimony and videographic evidence of Israel's crimes. And yet, like you said, people like Zentz are actually siding with the genocidal regime in the case of the Palestinians, where the case of genocide is infinitely stronger than it is in the case of the Uyghur people. So this tells you all you need to know about the real objectives and the bona fides or lack thereof of the uh, people who are determining foreign policy in Western governments. So, Rami, why don't we start taking a few questions before we close it out for today?
Yes. So I had a question here, which is, um, well, someone decided to ask a question related to the topic of Israel's plan to create some form of larger presence in the Middle East.
Hmm.
This project as often goes through the name of Greater Israel Project. Now, Dimitri, I'm not too familiar with that specific project itself, but what I do know, Dimitri, is that Israel has been behind many coups and throughout the so-called Arab Spring. Israel was behind the initial claims to take down Saddam Hussein in Iraq. Israel was behind, well, since the 1990s, Netanyahu was claiming Iran is minutes away from getting a nuclear bomb. Israel pushed NATO to put up a no-fly zone over Libya and to take down Gaddafi. There are also claims that Israel played a role in dividing Sudan and empowering the South Sudanese rebels and other rebel groups in Sudan. UAE and Saudi Arabia, well, Saudi Arabia even more so, um, have been under the boot of Israel. UAE ended up signing the Abraham Accords. So while I don't know about necessary Israel's, if it has made it public its ambitions to capture more land,
Hmm.
it has occupied, at least politically, a greater segment of the Arab world than before.
Hmm.
Any thoughts on this, Dimitri?
Yeah, is it so? The exact question was
If we could talk about Israel's ambitions in
right.
capturing more land in the Middle East.
So that's a very important question, and I think we should always start by remembering that no government is monolithic. No political elite is monolithic, and that's true of Israel. I think there is a large consensus amongst the Israeli political elite, a very powerful consensus, it's almost universal, that Israel should control and exercise sovereignty over the whole of historic Palestine. I think that there is essentially unanimity in the Israeli political elite about the Golan Heights. They have no intention of giving that up. That is definitely part of their Greater Israel project. And I think most of them, not necessarily all of them, but most of them, certainly view South Lebanon as being part of Greater Israel. Uh, I, the reason why I say that not necessarily all of them are of that view, because some of those people who are decision makers have this sufficient military experience and expertise to understand that it's next to impossible for Israel to exercise permanent sovereignty over South Lebanon. They've just failed yet again to do that. at significant cost to the Israeli military. They've tried repeatedly to occupy South Lebanon, and they've always been driven out. So I think there are some people in the political and military elite of Israel who think that that's, at least for the foreseeable future, an unrealistic goal. But there are others who think it's a realistic goal. And we saw some indication of that, Rami, when we talked about the death in South Lebanon of this amateur historian from Israel named Ziv Erlich. He has, before he was killed about a month ago in combat in South Lebanon, he was being accompanied by the chief of staff of the so-called elite Golani brigade of the Israeli military. They let him in there apparently without official authorization from the upper echelons of the Israeli military. And while he was at an archaeological site in South Lebanon, he and the soldiers accompanying him were attacked, and he was killed, as was another soldier, and numerous other soldiers, including the chief of staff of the Golani brigade, were injured. There were a lot of questions swirling. This story seems to have kind of faded from public view in Israel because the Lebanon ceasefire overtook it. But what appears to be the case is that Ziv Erlich repeatedly went into South Lebanon to try to manufacture a narrative that historically and culturally South Lebanon belonged to Israel, was properly thought of as part of northern Israel. So there's no question that there are people in the Israeli military and political elite who have designs on South Lebanon, but those designs for the time being have been thwarted. And, I'm sure that they want to retake Gaza. They've made no bones about that. They want to own Gaza. They want to, there are elements within them that think there are parts of the Sinai or the entirety of the Sinai should belong to Israel. And that even parts of Jordan and Iraq should belong to Israel. If you go back and just look at a map, it's amazing what you can learn in geopolitics just by taking a good, hard look at a map. Israel is a geopolitical pipsqueak. It is really difficult for Israel to sustain a dominant position in West Asia, which it aspires to do and always has, unless it engages in territorial expansion. It is very vulnerable in its current configuration. That's just a practical reality. There are a lot of people in the Israeli political and military elite who are going to pursue an expansionist policy at great cost to the indigenous peoples of the region unless we put a stop to it.
There's a question here from Harvey which says, tell us what you know about the British air bases on Cyprus and their supporting genocide. Can you tell us more, please? Dimitri, you've been to Cyprus multiple times. I believe you were at the proximity of one of these locations. What did you find there?
Hi, Harvey. Thank you for the question. Yeah, I've been to the Akrotiri military base 5 times in the past year. This is on the southernmost peninsula of the island of Cyprus. At the time that Cyprus gained independence, I think it was back in 1960, from Britain, the British demanded that they retain under their sovereign control. These are not just leased military bases. They actually are technically part of Britain to this very day. 2 splices of land on the south of Cyprus, one of which is Akrotiri. So when I went there, in my stays at the edge of the military base, I couldn't get into the military base. I went right up to the barbed wire fence that cordoned it off from the general public. I was there from anywhere from 1 to 3 hours on each visit, and on each visit I saw at least one huge military transport plane take off and head in the direction of Israel. And it has been widely reported by Declassified UK that those military transport planes are carrying all kinds of military equipment. So just extrapolating from what I saw myself, it seems like during the day, because of the frequency with which I saw these things taking off, they're probably somewhere between 4 and 6, possibly more than 6 huge Airbus, manufactured military transport planes taking off from Akrotiri, delivering equipment to Israel every day. It's a huge amount of weaponry and other military equipment. In addition, Declassified UK has documented that there are spy planes, sophisticated British spy planes, taking off from Akrotiri and going over Gaza, perhaps going over South Lebanon. They're undoubtedly sharing intelligence with the Israeli intelligence, military and intelligence communities. And they're using that to wage war on the Palestinian people and the people of Lebanon. There are also certain planes, again, great reporting by Declassified UK. And by the way, on the spy planes, when I was there, I saw drones taking off and landing at Akrotiri. I don't know where they came from, where they were going, but I would assume it was Israel. And Declassified has also documented that certain American military aircraft have been flying to and from Akrotiri, Tel Aviv, and these particular military aircraft are known to be used by U.S. Special Operations Forces. So that's what we know. And just by the way, I want to say something about these arrest warrants against Netanyahu and Gallant issued by the ICC in this context. You know, countries in Europe have begun to come out. Initially, they were mouthing these empty platitudes about how they're going to respect the decisions of the ICC, but none of them actually said that they were going to arrest Netanyahu once those arrest warrants were issued. And now, as some time has gone by, France's government has actually came out and said, we're not going to do it. We're not going to arrest him. They have a valid defense, which is total nonsense. The Hungarian government has said, we're not going to arrest them. You know, we're starting to get noises out of the British government, which raise serious questions about whether or not they're going to arrest them. And it occurred to me that we're almost certainly not being told the full extent of the support that European governments have given to Israel. You know, what we found out about Akrotiri, really we found out because of some wonderful investigative reporting. It was because the British government told us. What is going through the minds of these Western leaders when they think about the possibility of Netanyahu being arrested and handed over to the ICC for prosecution? Well, if I was one of them and I was just looking out for my own, you know, interests, I'd be very concerned that if Netanyahu is in the custody of the ICC and is being prosecuted for war crimes, he's going to spill the beans. He's going to tell them exactly. If you can imagine if he's arrested by the British government, what is he going to do? He's probably going to do everything he can to implicate the British government in his crimes, just to revenge himself. And I'm sure that the leaders of Europe understand this. So they have a powerful reason, self-interested reason, not to hand Netanyahu over to the ICC. And that reason is that Netanyahu knows about all their dirt and is going to expose their dirty laundry to the whole world if he ends up being prosecuted by the International Criminal Court.
Dimitri, we had a question from For a Just World that says, do you think Turkey will still be allowed in BRICS?
Great question. I think it's highly doubtful at this time that Turkey now has any reasonable prospect of being allowed into BRICS. I think that the Russian government, it's not just the Russian government, the Chinese government is clearly aligned with Iran. It clearly doesn't want to see the government of Syria destabilized. It doesn't want to see Iran isolated. And, you know, Erdogan has now left no doubt in anybody's minds where his sympathies lie. He is, you know, decidedly in the NATO/US camp. I don't think, you know, that the Chinese and the Russians and other BRICS members were so naive as to think that he wasn't. But if they had any doubts in their mind about where his sympathies lie, those have now been put to bed. I would be astonished if, you know, Russia and China would support Turkey's entry into the BRICS anytime soon.
I have a slightly different understanding, Dimitri. I would say that, well, the BRICS organization is a bit less of a, I mean, the way I understand it is that it's, it hasn't really, there's conflicting groups within BRICS themselves, right? You have China and India that have border disputes that do oppose each other a bit to a certain extent within the same organization. They've added the United Arab Emirates, and we know the United Arab Emirates isn't this organized, it's not the state that is hostile to the United States. I think it depends. They would be careful in adding Turkey in a military pact, in a more political defense pact. But if we view BRICS as a purely economic one, that's where I think Turkey might, well, China and Russia would still find support in adding Turkey to this organization. And I do think
can I
that.
ask a question about that, Rami? So just
Go for it.
let's flesh this out. So we know that the West is intensely hostile to the development of an alternative currency, reserve currency, and to the development of an alternative to the SWIFT system in the global banking sector. And in fact, Trump is so hostile that he's threatened uh, to sanction
Sanctions. Yeah.
any BRICS country that participates in the development of an alternative currency, right? So let's suppose they let Turkey in purely for economic purposes. They leave it out of any military pacts. Well, Turkey's going to be privy to all of the discussions and plans about the development of an alternative currency and an
Hmm.
alternative to the SWIFT system in the global banking sector. Aren't they going to be worried that Turkey's going to share this intelligence with the Western governments and that that's going to help Western governments to impede them? I, I would think
I
yes.
think, yeah, I would think so as well. But now the question is, will the West still be able to crack down on these new currency projects that the BRICS would be pushing forward? Because these projects would go forward whether Turkey is part of the organization or not, and the United States would still be aware of those whether Turkey is part of the organization or not. I mean, America still has some sort of a better relations with India than China would as well, and we've seen India play will commit to certain projects and positions that went against Russia and China, and at some point even entertained possibly buying oil from different sources than Russia. So I think it's something that I mean, clearly none of us will have the answer, and time will tell what's going to happen with Turkey. But I know this is a great discussion happening on Twitter, and there's lots of nice positions on that. In terms of new questions, I think we have time for a few more. Um, there's a note coming in from Maximums, which says everything looks so hopeless. The Zionist failed has been lifted, and people can see what they stand for. Besides that, any good news in the future? I think it's important to be optimistic, of course, or else the people in Palestine wouldn't be fighting. Uh, Russia would be capitulating. So there's clearly, in my opinion, good developments happening around the world. Um, I like to see that what America is doing is trying to grab any form of control it can before it loses it all. And I think we're seeing it behave extremely reckless. When I see Ukraine using long range missiles supplied by the West to bomb Russia, I don't see a stronger Ukraine. I actually see a weaker America because we've moved on from, I mean, we used to have these confrontations happening on our own territories in the global south. Now these conflicts are happening closer to the West, and they don't know how to react to this. Since the special military operation in Ukraine started, we've had developments happening in Palestine. We've seen, well, there's a long list of countries trying to join BRICS, more than I could even count. And we're seeing Iran a lot more composed. So as much as there's what might seem like uh, defeats coming in, I would say that the the um, the actions happening right now are nothing is being decided by the Americans themselves, and everything is being decided by the global South, and the West is just reacting. The balance of power has switched. So this is where I like to find my hope for a better tomorrow. And yeah, Dimitri, any thoughts on this?
Well, let's start by focusing on Palestine. The situation in Palestine does look very grim for the Palestinian people on the surface. But if you take a long view, as I try to do, actually think it looks extremely good because ultimately, I've said this many times, I'm going to repeat it until I'm blue in the face. Israel is a geopolitical pipsqueak, or another way I like to put it, it is a giant U.S. military base masquerading as a country. Israel's ability to dominate the Palestinian people and other indigenous peoples of the region depends entirely on the strength of the United States, the power of the United States, the ability of the United States to project its power throughout the region. Without U.S. support and U.S. strength, Israel is nothing. And Israel's benefactor, the pillar of its strength, is collapsing. The United States is losing. It's having its ass handed to it in Ukraine, as I said. It ran from Afghanistan with its tail between its legs, fighting against an insurgent force that had nothing but Soviet-era small arms. It has not been able, despite its efforts, to achieve one of these so-called color revolutions in Georgia, for example. It lost the war in Syria. It tried for years through brutal warfare and the use of the most extreme and violent proxies to overthrow a government, for whatever you may think about it, was an important part of the axis of resistance to U.S. hegemony in the region. They failed to overthrow Assad, and I think they're very likely going to fail again this time. That doesn't make me a fan of Assad. It's just I'm just recognizing the limits of U.S. power. These limits are real and they're growing, and the U.S. power is declining, and that means inevitably Israel will be disempowered. It is already greatly weakened, and soon it will lose the capacity to dominate the Palestinian people. What I worry about the most is, number one, will these lunatics in the West, when they finally come to terms with the fact that they cannot preserve their power by conventional means or by economic warfare, will they resort to nukes? That's my number one concern. And my number two concern is, until we reach that point where the West must accept a much more limited role in the world and that it can no longer dominate the peoples of Global South, how many people is it going to kill in the interim? It's, as we can see every day, its capacity for depravity is unlimited. So we can do a lot of harm until we finally come to that point where the Americans accept the limits of their power. But eventually, assuming we don't have a nuclear war, they will have to come to terms with the limits of their power, and so too will Israel.
Dimitri, the American deterrence, Israel's deterrence collapsed. Russia was able to prove that it can fight a war against NATO, right? Russia is not fighting Ukraine in this war. It's fighting all of these American and European weapons factories that are just funneling weapons back into Ukraine. The deterrence is broken. And we're seeing this as well in changes and elections happening in Europe. There's an election going on right now, parliamentary election happening right now in Romania. The presidential election came in as a big surprise where the anti-NATO presidential candidate ended up finishing first. There's a lot more distrust happening in Europe. An increase in cost of living is getting people to revolt against their own governments. So I'm actually extremely hopeful. Now, what we need to make sure is that that the people that are unhappy in our countries resort to the proper solutions and hold the right people accountable and find the proper justification to justify why our cost of living is expensive, why we've been in continuous wars for the last 200-300 years. So I think it could go either way. The Palestinians are teaching the world what's wrong in our world. There is an axis of resistance being formed around Palestine, Syria, Russia, China, Yemen, Iran, Iraq, the list goes on. So I'm extremely hopeful on that front. But yes, will America accept to finish second in a peaceful way? Will
it doesn't even have to do that. It just has to, accept. It doesn't have to accept it's inferior to anybody. It just has to accept that it doesn't get to tell other countries how to run their affairs. That's all. No, I don't think any of these rivals of the United States geopolitically aspires to tell Americans how to live. That's not what they want to do. I think they've been very clear, and there's no reason to doubt them. The American people can run their country the way they see fit. Just stop interfering in our countries. That's all they want. And allow us, let's enter into economic relations that are mutually beneficial instead of exploitative. And stop interfering in our internal affairs, respect our sovereignty. So the American people aren't going to have to accept an inferior status. What they're going to have to accept, and what the U.S. elite is going to have to accept, that they can no longer dominate the rest of the world. That's
and they can no
clearly
longer send nuclear submarines between Taiwan and China, and Canada's doing that as well. And so that's definitely things that we need to keep track of. Now, Dimitri, you've mentioned that we have some good interviews coming up this week. You said Matthew Ho, What else, Dimitri? These names kind of.
So, Dr. Gilbert, tomorrow I'll be interviewing Dr. Gilbert Doctorow, an American expert in Russia who's based in Brussels. You'll see him. You may have seen Dr. Doctorow give interviews on Judging Freedom with Judge Napolitano. He's been on Dialogue Works with Niba Al-Khurshid. He's been on numerous other widely followed independent media platforms talking about the war in Ukraine and the reality of the political and economic reality of life in Russia. So I'm interviewing him tomorrow. On Tuesday, I'm going to be interviewing Matthew Ho, former captain in the U.S. Marines, he currently is with the Eisenhower Media Foundation. Again, he just returned from 8 days in Palestine. On that same day, I'm going to interview Kevork Almasian, a fascinating fellow. He's of Armenian origin, but he was raised in Aleppo in Syria, the city that's currently being assaulted by these terrorists that are backed by Turkey. And then Wednesday, for the first time, I'll be interviewing Larry Johnson, former CIA analyst. Again, he's somebody you see frequently on Judging Freedom with Judge Napolitano and on various other independent media platforms, including Dialogue Works. So it's going to be a very busy week. We're going to be publishing those interviews over the course of the entire week, not just in the first 3 days. And we'll be back next Sunday for our weekly live stream.
Yes, absolutely. Dimitri, it was a pleasure chatting with you today on this live stream. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in. Make sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel, as well as Telegram, Patreon, Substack, Instagram. If you want to find all of our links, you could click on any YouTube video in the description. We have a list of links. But most importantly, join Telegram, because if ever we are deplatformed, we will be able to share content there. It was a pleasure, folks, and see you next Sunday.
Peace out, everybody.